Welcome to today's program of Free to Fly. The title of my message today is God's Detours. Shall we turn in our Bibles to Exodus chapter 13 and read from verses 17 to 18. Then it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. And the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. We see how for many years, the people of Israel were held captive in the land of Egypt. And finally, after about 400 years, Pharaoh had let them go. Eventually, after God did many signs and wonders and there were many plagues, and eventually Pharaoh let the Israelites go. And we would have imagined that after these people had endured that much of suffering and they were under such bondage in the land of Egypt as slaves, we would have expected, we knew that God was taking them to the promised land. And naturally, they would have imagined that God would take them there using the quickest possible route. Simply because they had suffered for so long and they would have expected this is how God is going to work. And they would have had, I'm sure if I was in their position, I would have had many plans. I would have thought, all my life, all I've known is slavery. This is what I'm used to, but I know that God has given us a promise. There is a promised land, and this is exactly what I'm going to do when I get to the promised land. I would have had my entire life mapped out. Perhaps from the time those people, each of them were born, they would have been thinking of this promised land and thinking of how different their lives were going to be, and perhaps they had it all mapped out. But now, as we read in Exodus chapter 13, when God took the people of Israel out of Egypt, we see that He did not take them along the quickest possible route. Now, the quickest possible route was when they came out of Egypt, it was almost like a direct line where they could have gone to the land of Canaan. The only thing is that they would have had to pass the land of the Philistines. And as a result, they would have naturally had to engage in war. And therefore, instead of taking them through that route where they would have to engage in battle, God took them in what seemed to be a detour. Instead of going directly from Egypt to Canaan, they had to go on a detour. And we see how God took them. As we read, that it was through the wilderness and along the Red Sea. Now, one translation says that the people of Israel were harnessed for battle. They were, in other words, they were physically prepared for battle. But that did not necessarily mean that they were actually prepared for battle. We need to understand that these people had been slaves. They were not prepared for battle. And God, in His sovereignty, knew that even though the people of Israel were taken, even though they were taken out of Egypt because of His mighty hand at work, nevertheless, He knew that they were not prepared to face the Philistines. And therefore, simply because God wanted the Israelites to experience His goodness, He wanted them to experience all of the blessings that He had in store for them. Therefore, and not only did He want them to receive it, He also wanted them to be able to retain it. And therefore, instead of taking them through the shortcut, He took them on a detour. Simply because He knew that if they faced battle at that point against the Philistines, it was inevitable the Israelites would have for certain turned back and gone back towards the land of Egypt. Similarly, we might be facing certain detours in our lives. But how do we respond when we face detours? Do you feel God is taking you on a detour right now? It may be that you have certain expectations, and perhaps God has given you a promise. Maybe God has shown you what He is going to do in your life, the plans that He has for you. Maybe you know that there is something great that He has in store. Yet at the moment, it does not seem to be that you are going in that direction. Maybe you've been waiting on the Lord is leading you, and yet you don't seem to be going in that direction. Now, I'm not saying that every single detour in our lives is because God has orchestrated it. Certainly not. Very often we find ourselves going in a totally different path because of our own doing. We don't listen to God, and therefore we take different paths and find ourselves in some completely different place. But what I'm talking about today is when God, in His goodness and His love, He takes us on a detour. The people of Israel, instead of God directing them through the shortcut, God took them through the wilderness and through near the Red Sea. Because God had something in mind. God saw something that these Israelites did not see. He wanted them to experience the fullness of His blessing. He wanted them to experience His goodness, and He wanted them to be able to retain it. Today, do you find yourself facing some kind of a detour? You are not at the place where you expected to be. And when we are facing such situations, it may be that right now you can't make sense of it. You can't make sense of God. You can't make sense of your situation, because what you have planned out for your life is completely different to what you find yourself in right now. I believe that many of us have certain plans for our lives. It may be from the time that we are young, we have plans. We think I need to do well in my exams. I want to get into university. And then once we get into university and we perhaps do well, I don't think any of us want to really fail. I don't think we aim at failure. We want to do well, and we generally have our lives mapped out. Perhaps after university, we want a good job. And then we plan, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a businessman. We have various plans for our lives. And maybe we've progressed along this path, and perhaps things have fallen into place to a great extent. Maybe along the way there have been various challenges and hurdles, yet we have progressed. But suddenly we find ourselves in a place where we just cannot make sense of anything. We know where we ought to be heading. We know that it is in a completely different direction, but yet we are in this place and it seems to be a detour. I cannot make sense. I cannot understand. God, why? Why is this? What are you doing? Have you forgotten about me? Didn't you give me a promise? And we have many questions for God. But what we need to understand is that if ever God takes us on a detour, it is entirely because of His goodness. Yet very often, not only do we stop at being confused and wondering why this is all about, we also get angry with God. Not only do we question God and are we confused as to what's going on, yet we also get angry with God. And there are many times that we begin to accuse God and say, Lord, you don't have a heart. You don't know what you are doing with my life. Surely don't you see the misery that I'm going through, the years of slavery, as the Israelites would have said, didn't you see how much I suffered? What are you doing with my life? And perhaps we have many questions like this from our God. But I want to assure you today that whatever detour you are experiencing right now, even if you cannot make sense of it, understand that God is good. The people of Israel probably never understood this at that point. All they could have seen is, we have come out of this land after hundreds of years of difficulty and of suffering. Surely, shouldn't God take us there directly? What is the delay? What is going on? They could have been, I'm sure they were so confused. But we see how God was working behind the scenes. God knew the people of Israel even more than they knew themselves. And therefore, in His love, He said, no, I will not let them go. I will not let them take this shortcut, because I know that if this is what they take, they will turn back and go. Therefore, they will not experience my blessing. They will not be able to receive it, neither will they be able to retain it. Have you ever stopped to think of why perhaps you are in this place right now, where maybe that you have come out of a difficult time, yet things don't make sense because you have not received what you are expecting from God. Maybe you have not received yet what God has promised. You don't understand what's going on. It may be a financial difficulty. Perhaps you've just come out of debt and difficulty, and God has promised you that He is going to take care of all of your needs, that He is going to prosper you. And yet you find yourself in a place where things don't make sense. But have you ever stopped to consider that it may be that if God blesses you in the way that He has promised right now, maybe you are not prepared to handle that kind of blessing. It may be that you might get back into the rut that you were in. Perhaps that you might be consumed by the love of money, which is the root of all evil. It is not money that is the root of all evil. It is the love of money. And therefore, if we are not in that place where God can entrust us with His blessing, the chances are that blessing we can turn that blessing into something detrimental to us, into something harmful to ourselves. And God knows that. God does not want to see us hurting ourselves. And therefore, we might find ourselves in this place right now where we have not experienced everything that God has promised. And we find ourselves in this place where it is a detour. I'm not heading, it does not seem like I'm heading in that direction. It may be even a relational difficulty, a relational issue. Perhaps you've just come out of a bad relationship and you're wondering, God, what are you doing? What is the delay? Have you stopped to consider that it may be that God is working out His plans and He's preparing you so that you are ready and that you will not find yourself in a mess again? So that God is preparing you so that you will be able to receive His blessing and to retain His blessing, so that you would be able to identify what His blessing is. God does not believe in just taking us through shortcuts alone, because He wants to bless us with every good thing. He wants to ensure that we can experience His goodness in our lives. It may be even your job today, your career. Perhaps you are wondering, Lord, this does not make sense. You have given me plenty of promises saying that you are going to bless me. Lord, what is going on? I don't understand. Where am I? Wherever I look, I cannot make sense. Because this does not seem to be the place where I should be. And then we start running around here and there, wondering what is going on. And then perhaps we might try to overrule God and try to teach Him what He should be doing, and start complaining and grumbling, not knowing what's going on.